The fundamental problem in the British countryside is that you have a pre-modern social class, the aristocracy, conflicting with a modern social class, farmers. As the ruling class, the aristocracy want control of the land, they want to rule it, whereas farmers can make decisions for themselves, so they're not compatible. So far on this channel, we've looked at a few different answers to this problem that were developed before the Second World War, and I thought it might be interesting just to do a quick overview of them, look at how they interact with each other and where they've developed since the war, and while we're doing a bit of housekeeping, I'll respond to some criticisms I've received as well. In the past few weeks, we discussed three ideologies that developed between the wars, which are very important because they form the basis of the modern environmental movement in Britain. But I don't think they are environmental ideologies, so to speak, but rural political ideologies that express themselves sometimes in natural terms. There is discussion of ideas like beauty and economic efficiency, but fundamentally these ideas are concerned with the class conflict that exists between farmers and the aristocracy. During the agricultural revolution, you get the partner in husbandry idea, which attempted to make aristocrats landlords who provided knowledge and guidance to their farmer tenants as partners in husbandry. I would argue this idea never really works very well, but it tried to fix the class conflict inherent in the modern countryside. The first ideology we discussed was promoted by grassland scientist George Stapledon and the post-war Labour government, as we shall see, and they wanted a scientific, progressive countryside that was both beautiful and efficient. Their vision was that the countryside would be planned to include green belts and national parks, preserving the countryside as an amenity for city people. But as part of this, they promoted small owner-occupiers on farms, like my family, in order to gently remove the aristocracy from the equation and leave only farmers with an interest in the land. Stapledon's ideas could be seen as a socialist vision for the countryside, and they were formulated into policy in the same political moment that gave us the National Health Service. But it could also be seen as an environmentalism. He was designing a progressive countryside fit for a modern Britain. Then we discussed Lord Lymington and Lady Balfour's proposals to return to feudalism, and in doing so, getting rid of farmers entirely and restoring the aristocracy to their rightful position as rulers over a nation of peasants. This was the organic movement, and it aligned itself with European fascism, and although it used nature in its rhetoric, it was a political movement. The emphasis on nature was to justify what they saw as the aristocracy's natural position as rulers. This could be seen as a conservative environmentalism. We discussed these ideas in this video, which was followed by a fun little bonus episode on Albert Howard. And thirdly, we looked at agricultural scientist Daniel Hall's proposals for land nationalisation, which intended to remove both the aristocracy and farmers from the land. Hall wanted to reorganise the landscape to promote efficiency, and the government would act as landlord, gently regulating capitalist corporations who would farm it, which we discussed in these episodes. So although these ideas have now developed into what we would recognise as environmentalism, they are political movements. People confuse rural politics for environmentalism. These ideas were concerned with access to and use of resources, class conflicts and social engineering. They appeal to nature in different ways, but don't let that confuse you. I wanted to discuss how these three ideologies relate to each other, because there's different ways of comparing them and they do overlap in places. This would make most sense if you've watched my entire history of agriculture up to this point. The debate that was had between the wars was very important because it discussed all of the problems that the countryside is again facing today. You have class conflict between farmers and aristocrats, with both classes struggling financially. You have a poor standard of nutrition in the wider population. You have a divide between town and country and a debate as to whether the country needs to be supported against those pressures. You have questions about food security within Britain's limited land area and questions about the role nature should play within society. It's very much the same. Politically, I think you could characterise the answers given as follows. You could argue that Lymington and Balfour were feudalists, following an ultra-conservative brand of aristocratic fascism, conservative to the point of being pre-modern. Meanwhile, Hall would be a capitalist. Although he did deny having any political leaning, he was trying to make the countryside work in a market economy. And Stapledon would be a socialist. I'm sure Stapledon, again, would reject that label, but his ideas were formulated into a socialised agriculture by the Labour Party after the war. These labels seem nice and distinct from each other, but in a lot of other senses it's a lot more muddled. You could argue that all three of these ideologies were environmentalist. Lymington wanted a conservative environmentalism that reduced human civilization back to what he sees as its natural state. Stapledon wants to preserve the beauty of the countryside into modernity and design it to be beautiful efficiently. With his national parks, he planned nature. So Stapledon's is a progressive environmentalism. Hall's proposals were inspired by a belief that soils were being neglected under the existing system, and the government as landlord would have to ensure that soils were preserved in a fertile state for future generations. On that point, all three of these ideas champion the importance of soil. Hall, as a scientist, understands that agriculture is based on soil. Stapledon is the same. His introduction of grass lays is about restoring fertility with crop rotation and manure. However, Lymington's focus on soil is slightly different in that to the organicists, soil is not just objectively important as it is to farmers and scientists, but rather the basis of a society based on blood and soil. And he thinks that scientists overlook that. So while he is pro-soil, he also insists that the other ideologies have overlooked the soil, which they hadn't at all. But people today do seem to think that agricultural scientists overlook the importance of soil, which shows the power of Lymington's rhetoric. But in most other ways, Stapledon's ideas are something of a compromise between the other two camps. Stapledon himself is a very interesting figure because he is an established, influential scientist running the plant breeding station at Aberystwyth, but he was also affiliated with Lymington and his friends and was part of Kinship in Husbandry, the organic movement during the war. But while Lymington wants to remove science from the equation altogether and Hall wants to completely redesign the British landscape to suit scientific advances, Stapledon wants to promote scientific methods while preserving the existing landscape. So Stapledon's position exists somewhere between the two. I think Lymington's school of thought does influence Stapledon. Lymington and his friends like to emphasise community and rural culture and the beauty of the countryside, but Stapledon reaches a much more moderate conclusion and he pushes for village communities to be preserved after the war and commuting townspeople to integrate with villagers and learn to respect their rural brothers and sisters. But Stapledon is also influenced by Orwin and Hall as he pushes for what is essentially a cheap food policy, and part of that is embracing mechanised and departing from the old ways of doing things that Lymington held so dear. So I feel Stapledon's ideology is in many ways a mix of a diluted version of Lymington's ideas about rural culture and community and beauty with a diluted version of Hall's push for the modernisation of agriculture and government planning. You could argue it's a compromise. It would also be very easy to credit the organic movement for raising problems such as the importance of nutrition for health, which was a central part of wartime and post-war government policy. But I don't really think they deserve the credit for that because Lymington and his friends were arguing about peasants being healthy, whereas at the same time you have established medical doctors like Christopher Addison and John Boyd Orr making the point much more credibly. But equally, I don't think it's fair to credit a fascist political group as being the only people who recognise the importance of the health of the soil. Hall's ideas would offend environmentalists today, but they were fundamentally based around the preservation of the fertility of the soil. That's why he wants to redesign the partner in husbandry idea. The government as landlord would protect the soil from the unfettered profit incentive. But despite that, we find ourselves in a situation today where people are actively promoting these fascist ideas as an antidote to the ravages of scientific farming, which is exactly how they were presented between the wars. For example, take this book, Look to the Land by Lord Northbourne. Allegedly, this was the book that coined the term organic. This book promotes British aristocratic eco-fascism. Blood and soil, peasants, all of the stuff we've discussed. The early organic movement existed in a really tight echo chamber, so if you've read one of their books, and I've showed you Lymington's, you've read them all, they're very similar. But with a book like this, you can see why somebody who considers themselves to be politically progressive, who's worried about climate change, might pick it up and read it and think, oh, he prefers nature to capitalism. Me too. I mean, this revised edition was printed in 2003 and its foreword encourages the reader to adopt these fascist ideas. It says Lord Northbourne's work, first published more than 60 years ago, was so remarkably prescient that only now, perhaps, are more profound ecological thinkers approaching the point where his deep metaphysical insights can begin to fructify their work. It is the publisher's hope, then, that Lord Northbourne's unique combination of gentleness and rigour will spur a new generation of readers to engage the burning issues of our day with some of the measure of compassion, artistic sensitivity and intellect he possessed. As I've said before, these ideas were ignored at the time because fascism wasn't very trendy while we were at war with Germany. But it's still fascism, it's literally the same book. But now people are being tricked into supporting these ideas because we've forgotten what ecofascism looks like. Before we continue, I shall address some criticisms I have received. In the episode on the organic movement, I got a lot of flack in the comments for suggesting that German fascism was progressive and came from the left. A lot of people said that that was so ridiculous they couldn't take the rest of the video seriously. I do try to provide evidence in my videos so you can base your own conclusions on them, and I am happy to accept critique because inevitably from time to time I will be wrong, but I should like to defend myself on that point. I said that German fascism as a whole was progressive and came from the left, which was not to say that I believed it was a left-wing ideology. I mention that because I think there is some perception that fascism is a problem for the right, when really anybody could become a fascist, and it's something that we must all fight within ourselves. My broader argument was that a defining feature of fascism was that it's irrational, as Umberto Eco said. So Nazism was able to exploit the sentiments and rhetoric of left-wing thought without materially being left-wing. But crucially, the hate that Nazism originally emerged from was aimed at capitalists. This article draws a fun parallel between the Nazis and a modern writer who would consider himself to be left-wing. Whilst we naturally think of National Socialism primarily in terms of racism, repression and brutality, its roots lay in campaigning against the faceless financiers and industrialists. It was these fat cats, the fascists claimed, who had orchestrated and profited from the Great War's destruction and would do so again in a heartbeat. This is a very interesting article, I've put it in the description. There was a left-wing influence within the Nazi Party that was increasingly pushed out before they reached power. I said they came from the left, they do move to the right. But Strasserism did exist as an economically left-wing strand of Nazi thought. It used class conflict as an analytical tool, pushed for the nationalisation of industry and opposed finance capital. There was definitely a left-wing influence there. The Nazis' 25-point plan of 1920 called for the nationalisation of all businesses. It wanted old age welfare, access to higher education, the state to promote the health of the population. Again, I'm not saying that I thought the Nazis were left-wing. Their ideology was inconsistent, and the left-wing elements were certainly more visible before they achieved power. But although Strasser was pushed out, it remained that Nazism was a progressive form of fascism in that it wanted to move forwards. It wanted technological advancement. It wanted demographic growth. And I wanted to establish this in that video because I wanted to contrast it with the organic movement in Britain, which had no left-wing influence whatsoever, so made no rhetorical attempt to appeal to workers in this way, and as a result was ultra-conservative to the point of being pre-modern. This is all very nebulous. These ideologies are irrational, as was my point. But I think it would be inaccurate to argue that there was no left-wing influence present when the National Socialist German Workers' Party started gaining traction, economically, if not socially, and that was what I was alluding to. Such comments are very welcome though, because they inspire me to try hard to get stuff right, so do keep them coming. I should also just like to emphasise that sometimes in my thumbnails and video titles I exaggerate my position slightly to make people click. In the episode where I claimed farmers are not capitalists, I actually argued that farmers often don't have money as their primary motivation, which is a little bit more nuanced but would have been a lot less catchy. People also said that I was wrong for various reasons under the episode where I discussed organic farming from a slightly more objective standpoint, which I suppose was inevitable. I did hide behind the scientist Vaclav Smil and the 97% of British farmers who don't farm organically. This channel is focusing on history at the minute, but I thought it important to briefly outline the importance of fertiliser from a practical perspective, and earlier I'd covered the importance of sprays in case people didn't have that basis of knowledge, because else when I start introducing Lymington's ideas they might not see the inherent flaws within them. When we've covered all the history stuff in a few months, we'll start looking more objectively at science, and all of these issues will be covered again in much more detail. But returning to the topic at hand, I think these ideologies developed between the wars are really interesting because the debate was so high level. Loads of really radical, well thought out proposals were put forwards. Even though what Lymington wrote was utter rubbish and was treated as such at the time, it was really well presented and had some incredibly strong themes, which is why its influence has been so enduring. But although the debate surrounding the countryside today follows all the same themes and is asking all the same questions that these people discussed, it isn't quite structured in the same way. Today, you don't seem to have agricultural scientists in the debate. There isn't a Daniel Hall character. You still have agricultural scientists doing really great work, stuff like manufacturing feed additives for cattle to reduce methane emissions while still producing food. But these people don't seem to exist on the public stage anymore. Can you name a prominent conventional agricultural scientist. Although Hall's ideology was perfectly in line with earlier writers who discussed progressive scientific agriculture, like Arthur Young in the 18th century and MacDonald in the 19th century, now that chain of thought seems to have died out. You do, however, still get people who promote organic farming and sometimes new ideas like veganism in a scientific but also at the same time anti-scientific way, like Albert Howard did. And this is something we will discuss objectively when we finish talking about history. There are still some traceable remnants of Stapledon's progressive environmentalism, if we should call it that. 15-minute cities, access to the countryside, an efficient public transportation system, I think are all urban ideas traceable to what Stapledon pushed for. But these ideas seem to have merged with the remnants of Lymington's ideology and are often pushed for at the same time as rewilding. I don't want to discuss rewilding in too much detail just yet, but I think it is a very thinly veiled expression of the aristocratic class interest and is the modern equivalent of Lymington's ideas. The rewilding movement is spearheaded by the Knepp estate, led by a man with a hereditary knighthood, and it aims to subsidise landowners to hold land but not work it. That is all the aristocracy have wanted since the agricultural revolution. It's entirely in line with the game laws, fox hunting and organicism. And although they've now ditched the idea of the peasant, there is still an emphasis on natural hierarchy to justify the social supremacy of the aristocratic class. They're obsessed with wolves, and wolves in their ideology are the overseers of the forces of the countryside, the top of the food chain, just as the peasant was in Lymington's worldview a generation earlier. I'm jumping ahead a bit there, but I say it because although the Soil Association was a fascist movement when it was founded and continued to be so for a few decades until the passing of the Lady Balfours and Jorian Jenkses of this world, I don't believe that people who support organic farming are fascists now, at least not in a political sense. But that doesn't mean we should let them off the hook. What they push for today is essentially a corrupted remnant of blood and soil ideology. And as a fascist idea, blood and soil never made sense, but the blood element of it was central. The idea was that through organic farming you could have an organic person who would fit within a natural social hierarchy. But the fact that today the eugenic part of this belief system has been rejected and now the emphasis is on soil doesn't mean that it's suddenly a good idea. These ideas were not designed to combat climate change, they were designed to bring back peasants. If universalised, organic farming would reduce the food supply considerably, and that is too dangerous to contemplate. It does make me laugh when you go to farming events and the people pushing for organic agriculture speak with very posh voices. The organic movement has not been completely severed from its hierarchical roots, but then to completely abandon your roots would perhaps be antithetical to their ideology. So this is still an idea that we must fight against, even if the aristocratic class interest has now moved on to a new cause. That said, the Soil Association do continue to venerate Balfour, who was a fascist, which I think is some cause for alarm. I don't think they're people who are particularly concerned about telling the truth. This is why I felt comfortable attacking Rebanks and Langford. They should know better. They can't not know that these ideas they promote came from fascism. And in Rebanks' case, he has dedicated himself to promoting an ideology that was explicitly intended to eradicate his own social class, which given his education is particularly bizarre. Given people are still promoting these ideas, it's no surprise that they are influencing the environmental movement. When people become concerned about climate change, it's very easy to turn to this established pro-nature rhetoric. But as such, I think to address climate change, we really need to understand ecofascism so we can identify its influences and remove its nonsense from our decision-making. Much of the environmental movement at current seems intent on putting money in aristocratic pockets so they can get rid of their tenants and still live in their castles. I know people don't see it in those terms, but that is the problem. The problem in the British countryside is that you have a pre-modern social class, the aristocracy, conflicting with a modern social class, farmers. That was the problem between the wars, and that is still the problem now. Stapledon's ideology didn't quite fix this when it was implemented after the war, but it came close. It scared a lot of aristocratic families away, and many of them went to Africa for a few decades, although now they've come back. Stapledon didn't get everything right, but I think we would do well to move closer to his conception of environmentalism. You'll see what I mean. We're on to the Second World War now. My camera cut off before I said goodbye. Thank you very much for your engagement. Please do subscribe, and I shall see you again next week.